Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. There is quite simply no one who I think brings more intelligence to discussions of the war for the free world. Certainly no one who brings the depth of knowledge of the struggle for freedom over millennia, not just decades, than our first guest. He is Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, a noted classicist, a professor, an author, an historian of great renown, and not least a member of the commentariat who excels in pieces like the one he wrote recently at National Review Online that I'm anxious to talk with him about, The Way of All Appeasement. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have a chance to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
You draw 5 important parallels between what we are witnessing at the moment with what I call the Obama bomb deal and other acts of appeasement that really, I think, are so stunning, so clear, and so ominous that I wanted to make sure we had a chance to visit with you quickly about them. Would you mind enumerating those for us?
Yes. What I try to do is emphasize aspects of appeasement we usually don't think about. And one of them, of course, is that the appeaser, that is the people who give the concessions, usually think they're going to be rewarded for their magnanimity, and they're usually despised as being weak. So in the case of the current Iran deal, we've already seen the Ayatollahs mock the administration and double down on their rhetoric, in the same way Hitler did to Chamberlain and earlier Stanley Baldwin. So there's something psychologically there that the Soviets probably like to deal with Reagan rather than the appeasing Carter, and the same thing was with the Iranians too. So people forget that, but weakness gives you no respect even from your enemies. Second thing is that it has a great effect on allies and the third party, whether Czechoslovakia in 1938 or Poland in 1939. They usually bear the brunt of the appeaser. The appeaser tries to shield himself in a way that Britain was an island and it wasn't connected to the continent. And France was way to the west, at least part of it, and this was an Eastern European problem in Czechoslovakia and Poland. And what we're doing is we're basically telling the Arab moderate, so-called moderate world in Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf monarchies that you're going to deal with this bomb, you're in range, or we're telling Israel, you're in range, or we're telling even some of the Eastern and Southern European countries, you're in range, but we have a breathing spell because of our distance and our military clout. So it's going to be harder. And then it has also a larger effect on the tone of strategy in the world at large. So after really pressuring and lobbying the Chinese and the Russians to sign on to this deal, which was they fought from the very beginning, now we've sort of pulled the rug out from under them. It has effects on even our allies on other issues. Greece, for example, they were negotiating, and we being the Western powers, but specifically the European Union was pretty tough on them. Now, what are they going to say? They're going to say, well, you gave more concessions to the Iranians on things that are existential in nature than you did on money with us.
Yeah, no, it's a really critical point. The one that I particularly wanted to address, though, Victor, is your notion that, not your notion, your factual analysis, that appeasers always wrongly insist that the only alternative to their foolish concessions is war.
Usually I think there's no alternative, it's either or. In fact, there was no urgency for us to cut this deal with Iran. Everything was going our way. Their economy was sinking. Their oil was being stockpiled. It couldn't be sold. Their money was frozen. They couldn't get their hands on arms. Their terrorist appendages were short cash, and it was getting worse. So we could have just smiled, waved to them, and said, you know what, we'll come back to us when you want to talk seriously. But of course, we were under a deadline, and that was the deadline of the Obama presidency, that he wanted to cut a deal for his so-called legacy before he went out of office. And then, of course, the other thing is we always forget the effect on the domestic political opinion. There were people who really thought, General Halder in his diary said that Hitler might be gone by end of 38 because there was a real anger and apprehension that Germany wasn't ready for war, and yet here was Hitler trying to provoke it. And there were 1 million people on the streets of Iran in 2009, and there is a domestic opposition to the theocracy, but not now, because now the people on the street are going to say, well, what did you do for us? Look what they did. They got us prestige, they got us money, the economy's back, we're taking over the whole Middle East, we got the bomb. So it's destroyed the internal opposition.
And created a more dangerous Iran by far in the process. Despite all of this, Victor, there is some concern among those of us who are opposed to this deal that having engineered an arrangement in which this accord, which the president says is not a treaty, will be dealt with under legislative arrangements that make it exceedingly difficult to reject it, that this will go through, and that will not just be the Security Council, it won't just be the Europeans, it will be we who will also allow this to go forward. One of the things that I'd be interested in your thoughts on is whether there was, in the instance of, you mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier, his handling of the Panama Canal Treaty and what flowed from, ultimately, its approval by the Senate at the hands of some key Republicans, it should be said, that might be a model for a kind of jiu-jitsu or lemonade making out of this lemon for Republicans who are opposed to the bomb and Iran and the foreign policy of this administration to boot.
Yeah, and Reagan was the lone voice in the wilderness, and he used that issue to introduce a whole critique of the Carter administration. He said what he did in the Panama situation, giving this strategic asset away into an unstable country, which, by the way, was pretty prescient when you look what the Chinese are doing in Panama. That is a metaphor for the arms talks with the Soviets, for Soviet behavior, for the whole perception of U.S. weakness from Afghanistan to the Tehran to the Chinese. At the time, he said that, and he was right. So it's the same thing. It has repercussions that go, that the ripples of this treaty go well beyond just Iran and the United States. And I don't, as far as the so-called treaty versus a resolution, I don't see how they can stop it, because our assumption was that it was a treaty, so then you need a two-thirds majority of the Senate. And now, because it's a resolution, you really do need an override of the Senate. So he's flipped a third of the Senate necessary, and he's going to override this veto. So it's not a question of whether it will be approved, but only when. And unless there's some development, the Iranians never can count on. They can always say something or do something very radical, but I assume that they'll tell people to shush and tell Hezbollah to calm it down a little bit, Hamas, and then as soon as it's ratified and approved, then we'll see what the ramifications are.
We'll be watching it closely, as I know will you. Victor Davis Hanson is our guest, hailing from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where he is the Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow in Residence. Let me just ask you one last question. The New York Times features prominently today a story that there have been requests for criminal investigation by the Justice Department by two inspectors general, including the Inspector General of the State Department, of Hillary Clinton for her handling of classified information and, more generally, I guess, her email insecurity. Can you give us a quick assessment, Victor, of how that might have come about and what it might portend?
We know the Obama Justice Department is entirely politicized, so any hint of a prosecution is political in nature, and that goes back, to the 2008 acrimony between the two, Obama and Clinton, and more importantly, they do not want her voicing criticism of the last 8 years in the 2016, and she's too centrist, they think. She's pretty left-wing, but they'd rather have a left-wing candidate, even if the left-wing candidate lost, than have anybody critique, because we all know what Hillary's going to do. She's going to run hard left in the primaries, and then she's going to forget all of that criticism and move to the center and sort of ankle bite the Obama administration when necessary for her own political viability, and they don't like that. So they're sending her a message, better be careful, because and they did this with Senator Menendez on the Iran deal, and they do it with everybody. They're just shooting a cannonball across her bow and saying, you know what, we're going to be monitoring you, and you better be very careful because you may get an indictment.
Yeah, it's the Chicago way. I think even just the fact that they've identified this as potentially criminal activity and there was classified information on her machines is going to be a problem.
There obviously was, but in the Obama administration, it's just a question of what's the political dividends or not to follow the law.
You will be monitoring it closely. We look forward to reading your writings on it at National Review and elsewhere. Victor Davis Hanson, and hopefully talking with you about it in the near future as well. Thanks so much for joining us. Come back to us again soon. Next up, Elon Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council tells us what he told Congress this week in opposition to this fatally flawed Obama bomb deal. That and more straight ahead.